Hi, folks. So, I have posted a lot on my TikTok and Instagram about the importance of properly preparing nuts, seeds, legumes, and grains if you are going to have them in your diet. And so, I've gotten a lot of requests on doing a tutorial on exactly how you go about that. Now, the proper preparation techniques that are really important to use for these kinds of foods are soaking, sprouting, and fermenting. You can pick one of those to do, or you can do any combination. Now, the reason this is so important, which I talk about a lot in my content, is that all of these foods, the seeds, nuts, legumes, and grains, really, biologically speaking, they're all seeds, right? They're all the babies of plants that you would plant in the ground, and a new adult plant will grow from that. Now, if you think about it, the seeds are the most vulnerable part of a plant, right? They need to make sure they contain enough nutrients in the seed so that even if they're planted in soil that's not super well fertilized, that it can still grow, that it can at least still propagate. And they also don't want to be eaten and broken down fully by any natural predator that wanders by. So they have a lot of mechanisms to prevent this from happening. There are parts of the plants that might be more okay with being eaten, especially the fruits, even the leaves and roots to an extent, although those have mechanisms to make sure you don't overeat them. But if we're talking about plant toxins, right, this whole idea of anti-nutrients that has become a really fad thing in some circles to talk about, it's really the nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes that have the highest content of these kinds of compounds. So they tend to be most difficult for people to digest among all plant foods. Now, the anti-nutrient thing, the plant toxin thing, I take a more moderate perspective on it. Some people think that the whole thing is just absurd and a fad, and that plant toxins really aren't dangerous at all, and in fact can have, beneficial effects, and, we shouldn't cut them out of the diet ever. And then other people have another extreme perspective that they're incredibly dangerous, that they're inherently toxic to the body, we should never consume them. And I actually think both of those angles is misguided. I do think that humans have been consuming foods with anti-nutrients in them for at least thousands of years, right, if not longer, depending on how far back you want to count, our ancestors into our species. And so I do think they are a natural part of a human diet to an extent. I do think that they are overeaten. They are eaten all year round, when ancestrally they were probably mostly eaten during the fall, when they are naturally in season, and, harvest time and all that kind of stuff. So I do think they are overeaten now. I do think people rely on them in their diet, generally too much. And even in traditional cultures, we see this shift. Once we see the shift from hunter-gatherer lifestyle to farming lifestyle, we see a decline in health happen. Now, not to the extent that we see in modern civilization. We still don't have the massive epidemics of chronic disease, but we do see, a little more arthritis, a little more tooth decay, a little more incidences of chronic infections, like these kinds of things. So hunter-gatherers that are eating totally seasonally and just having a minor amount of these foods in the diet versus people that are really relying on these foods as dietary staples all year round, we do see a decline in health, even if it's minor. So I do think then today people even consider them superfoods and sometimes eat them in massive doses that they were never meant to be eaten that way. And so I do think they're overeaten, and I also think that traditional farming communities do prepare these foods in traditional ways, using the proper preparation methods I was talking about with nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes, where they are soaking, sprouting, and fermenting. And this lowers the amount of anti-nutrients in these foods. Now, it doesn't completely take them away, but it does get them considerably lower, especially lectins and phytic acid. These are sometimes, with proper processing methods, they can be taken down to pretty negligible levels. So I do think that makes a big difference. I do think we should eat them in moderation, but I do think proper preparation methods make a big difference. And I also think that there are people who do need to eliminate them for some time. There are some people whose digestion cannot handle these foods, even when they are properly prepared. Now, ideally, we want you to heal enough and become resilient enough, for that is not always true, right? That won't be true forever. I always want people to get to a place in their health where they feel like they have options. But a lot of my clients, I do take these foods out temporarily. And then when we add them back in, I teach them the proper preparation methods, and I teach them how to eat them in moderation, right? To not rely on them as staples in their diet. So, all that being said, if you are someone who has done a lot of healing and you're ready to add these foods back, or you are pretty healthy, but you just want to boost your health a little more, and maybe get in touch with your ancestry, and have more traditional cooking skills in your life, I am going to show you how to do it. So the first thing is probably the easiest, and this is soaking. And this method is the least effective at taking down the toxicity level, but it does help, right? Now, I'm going to do all these demos with sunflower seeds because I'm doing a class later where I'm going to be making sunflower seed rolls. Um, and so this is what I have on hand. But everything I'm teaching you will apply to any nut, seed, grain, or legume. And if there's exceptions, I'll share about those. So, just know that even though I'm just using sunflower seeds, this applies to anything you're going to do. Now, I will say I am not super stoked with this product because you see how the bag is clear and it's exposed to light. This makes it much more likely that these seeds are going to go rancid more quickly. I really do find that this is true. I have bought sunflower seeds in clear bags before, and the final product of what I made went rancid, within a week. Where they kind of get this like musty off flavor, right? It's just basically the oils in it oxidize. Nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes, they're all very high in omega-6 fats, which is a very unstable, more inflammatory oil. It's part of the reason I don't recommend people overeat them. But they will oxidize easily when exposed to light or heat. So this is why it's so dangerous to cook with things like sunflower seed oil, right, or canola oil or things like that. So I'm not stoked about this product, but it's the only thing I could find, so we're dealing with it. But when you are buying your own nut, seeds, grains, or legumes, try to find them in bags where they are blocked from light. So don't buy out of bulk bins. Try not to buy them in clear bags. So soaking is really just an overnight thing. So if you know you want to cook with them the next day, what you do is you just put them in a bowl. And then you want to just cover them with filtered water. I'm going to do that. And it doesn't need to be a lot, you just want them to be basically covered. Now, you can just soak them in water. That's totally fine. You could also add a little bit of salt. This will help with that detoxifying mechanism. So you can add a little bit of salt, because basically the water is going to be soaking up the anti-nutrients. This is especially true for phytic acid. It's fairly effective just to soak in water these foods to reduce the phytic acid levels. The other thing you can add to it is apple cider vinegar. So you can just add a dash of that. And basically what you want to do is just get a clean cloth napkin, or if you have a pot or a bowl that has a lid, or a jar with a lid, you could use any of these things. You just want to cover it, just make sure bugs don't get into it and have a fun time. So you just cover it, and you would just leave it overnight, right? And then in the morning you would come and you would just drain it. You would just put it through a fine mesh strainer, or you could drain it through cheesecloth, whatever you have on hand. Drain it through this napkin that you used, whatever. And This is, like I said, the most basic detoxification method, so it's the least effective, but it will reduce some of the, especially phytic acid levels a little bit. And then you can use it like as a topping on your yogurt, right? Or, sprinkle it on a salad or things like that. Now, because you're soaking it in water, they're going to be a little softer, right? If you don't like that texture, what you can do afterwards, spread them out on a baking sheet, put them in the oven at the lowest temperature it goes to. So usually that's like 150, 170 Fahrenheit. I'm in Mexico, so I'm thinking about this stuff a lot more. And you will just bake it at the lowest setting for, a lot of people say 6 to 8 hours, but I actually find that like 3 to 5 hours is usually plenty. So yeah, just check and see when they're dry and a little crispy. I don't actually recommend roasting because, again, the omega-6 fats, they're pretty unstable. And so there's a lot more risk of them going rancid when you bake them at high temperature or roast them. So that's, if you want them a little crunchier, you can then dehydrate them afterwards. And then, yeah, they're good to go as just a basic topping. Now, the next thing that you can do, so the second technique would be sprouting. This is actually pretty effective at reducing especially the lectin content. Definitely the phytic acid content, but also the lectin content. Basically, with all these techniques, you're trying to trick the seed into thinking that it has already been planted and sprouted, so it can let its defense mechanisms down. So if you're actually sprouting it, it's going to be like, cool, I was successful. And it's going to let all its defense mechanisms down, and the anti-nutrient levels are going to drop. So if you want to sprout it, you would still soak it overnight to just saturate in water and get them nice and moist. But I wouldn't put the salt or the apple cider vinegar in. I would just do it in filtered water. And then you do want to get a jar. Where did I put the jars? Oh, I put them away. You want to get a glass jar, and I'm going to do this over the sink so I don't spill too much. And so I know I put salt and apple cider vinegar in this one. I'm not going to actually sprout these. I'm just going to demo. You put them in a jar the next day after you sprout them. Or, sorry, after you soak them. Okay. And you could fill this totally, full if you want to. I'm just demoing, so I'm not worrying about it. So these have already been soaked overnight. So now you put them in a jar. What you're going to do is, there's 3 ways you could do this. I just have access to these cloth napkins. They're just plain cotton, undyed napkins. So you can do that, and you put it over the top and secure it with a rubber band. Now, you could also use cheesecloth. Or you can buy special sprouting lids. So especially if you're using a mason jar, they make sprouting lids that fit in mason jars. And so these are just like fine mesh metal lids that would replace like the cover part of a mason jar. And so you could use one of those as well. You can buy them on Amazon or something like that. Okay, and so now if they won't usually sprout when they're full of water, so you do want to drain the water so then they can sit. So how I do that is just tip it. You see this? Yeah. Tip it and pour the water out. And this is what's nice about the sprouting jars, is that this will go faster. Obviously with a napkin or cheesecloth, it's going to drain a little bit slower. But once you've gotten most of the water out, what you do, and you do kind of want, you don't want the napkin to like totally cover it because you want it to be exposed to light. That's part of how it's going to sprout. But you put it at a diagonal in the bowl. And that way, whatever excess water is left in there, it will drain into the bowl. And so it won't get musty or moldy. Now, you do want it to continually be exposed to dampness, So what you can do, depending on how hot and dry your climate is, I would say 1 to 3 times a day. Rinse them with filtered water. So just pour filtered water in the top here, or take it off and fill it, and then put it back on, and then drain it again and set it diagonally in that bowl again. Now, it really depends on what you are sprouting, how long it takes. So when I do this with lentils, for example, like this happens within like 12 hours. Like sometimes I don't even mean to sprout them, I'm just soaking them, and I'm like, oh, they sprouted. So there are some of these plants that sprout very, very quickly and very, very easily. Sunflower seeds are a little bit more of a medium. Usually I find they take more like 2 to 3 days, of continually doing the rinsing and draining. And some of them, like almonds, they can be a little stubborn. I have had trouble getting some of these types of plants to sprout at all. Some of them are a little more sensitive, a little more temperamental. So you'll just kind of have to experiment. But some people are really, successful with all of these. Sometimes it just takes practice and just kind of getting the hang of it. But it can take up to 3 or 4 days, depending on the type of plant. So just keep rinsing it, keep soaking it, put it in a sunny space where it's going to get exposed to light and all that, and eventually it will happen. I will say that not all of these will have a dramatic sprouting, look, like you think about like broccoli sprouts or radish sprouts or something where it's very dramatic when they sprout, and people who are sprouting those for the greens. When you're dealing with these kinds of foods, sometimes the sprout is very tiny. Like you will just see a little tiny crack in the seed and like a little tiny thing poking out. But that's fine. Once it's sprouted, it signals to the seed, drop your defenses. So it can be a tiny little sprout, and it's effective. Okay, so sprouting is the second most effective way of lowering anti-nutrient levels. The third thing to do is to ferment. And this is the most effective way to lower anti-nutrient levels. Now, you can ferment soaked and sprouted seeds. Or you could just go straight to fermenting. So like I said, you can do any combination of this. So if you are first introducing this and you're a little bit nervous about how your digestion is going to handle it, do all three. Soak it, then sprout it, and then ferment it. So the best way to ferment it is to make it into a flour, so to make it into like a paste. That's the easiest way to ferment it. Now you don't have to. So for example, if I'm making rice, I sometimes just want rice. I don't want rice flour, right? So I will soak it. And then I will drain the water, and then I will add a fermentation starter to it, stir it around, and just leave it overnight, right? And the rice will start to ferment, even just overnight, and it will help the digestibility. And it makes a really nice, moist rice dish. So it's a great technique just to make it tastier, too. But especially with nuts and seeds, I find that it can be more effective to make it into a flour first. So it's especially nice to bake with fermented nut or seed flour. So I took these sunflower seeds that I had soaked already, and you can do the dehydration thing, like I said before, where you spread them out and you bake them and you get them nice and dry, and then you can pulse them in a food processor until it makes like a fine flour. Now, sometimes, depending on how powerful your food processor is, you will still have a few larger bits here and there. Like here's one kind of whole seed that didn't quite get ground. But most of this is very fine, see? And, it can be kind of nice texture-wise to have a few larger seeds in there. But you just want it to be mostly ground so that you can easily bake with it. So yeah, just pulse it, pulverize it until it gets to be a flour consistency. And then you want to add a fermentation starter. I don't usually like to just wild ferment this kind of thing. I think my experience has been it gets yeast and mold very easily if you don't add some kind of a starter. So I tend to do that just to make sure we are getting good guys in there. So you can use a few different starters. If you are lactose intolerant especially, you can use the fermented vegetable brine. So this is a recipe I give to a lot of my clients. I think it's in my sauerkraut tutorial video that I have on here. But basically, it's the fermented vegetable water that is, the excess when you're making sauerkraut, or sometimes I just have people make the brine in particular. So you can use that. So you would just pour it in, usually a quarter, half a cup, depending on how much, base you have is plenty. You basically just want it to be generally saturated. It doesn't have to be drenched, but just so it's generally saturated, like everything's like at least a little bit moist. I like to use yogurt. That's my favorite thing. And when you bake, after it's been fermented in yogurt, it makes the texture really moist and lovely. Sometimes when baking with these alternative flours, the product can be a little dry. But you can also use like the whey drippings. So if you, for example, were making farmer's cheese or like the homemade cream cheese that I talk about making too, I think I talk about that in my yogurt tutorial on here. You can use the drippings from that, the whey drippings, as a fermentation starter as well. You could also use a little bit of filtered water and like a few probiotic capsules. I mean, you could do that. It's probably a more expensive way to do it. You could just use a few spoonfuls of yogurt or a few spoonfuls of fermented vegetable brine as well. So you can ferment this up to 72 hours. I mean, you could do up to 3 days. I find that, especially if I'm, busy and I'm not able to stir it a couple times a day, it will get moldy after about the second day. So either you need to be really diligent about stirring it a couple times a day to make sure that no one area is exposed to air for too long, because that's how some of that more mold and yeast can start to form, is when it's exposed to air. Or you could just do it like for 12 to 24 hours. I find that that's a pretty safe amount of time. And it gets the full fermentation effect, and I've never seen it grow any kind of yeast or mold. You'll know because the mold is visible, right? Like you'll see white or black or something on it, so don't eat it if that happens. And yeasty, like it'll smell like yeast. Like it'll smell like wine or something a little bit, right? You'll definitely be able to smell it. Now, a little bit of like a slightly musty kind of smell is normal, but it shouldn't be like a turnoff. Like you shouldn't have like a primal like instinct of like, ugh, because that is a safety mechanism built in to tell you don't eat that. But for the most part, this is very, very safe. Again, especially if you're stirring it regularly or doing it for under 24 hours. So after this, you can use it as a baking base. You could also make it into a butter by then blending it with like some ghee or coconut oil or something like that and making it really oily, and making it into like a spreadable butter. Okay, so I think that's all I have to say about this. So that's my tutorial on properly preparing nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes. As I said, I demoed with the sunflower seeds, but these apply to anything. The one exception that I forgot to mention is if you are soaking legumes, you want to use baking soda and not apple cider vinegar. There's a difference in the chemistry of legumes, so beans, like chickpeas, things like that, that will make them tougher if you use an acid and softer if you use a base. So with the legumes, you do want to use baking soda when you're soaking them instead of apple cider vinegar, but otherwise everything I said really applies to all things. Some of the stuff is a little more stubborn to sprout, but you just have to kind of self-experiment and see what happens. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video and it was helpful.